Hi, everyone. Welcome to our seminar or webinar for today. My name is Panos Patros. I am the chair of the Tira Hangarau IT Engineers, which is a new technical interest group. We aim to represent all information engineers or information technology engineers. So if you're writing code, if you're dealing with computers and software, please come join us. We need you. So our talk today will be around the MIQ registration system, and we're using this as a means to discuss things that we should be doing while we're developing good quality software. And this discussion will be led by Kenneth Johnson, who is with the Department of Software Engineering, right, Ken, as well?
Yeah, computer science and software engineering.
Computer science and software engineering. Yeah, I'm with the Department of Software Engineering. Yeah, but University of Waikato. Ken is with AUT. So with this, Ken, thank you very much for being the lead in this talk. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Right, so we'll be talking about the MIQ system and just give some context about why that system was developed and what it is used for, and I'll just discuss a little bit about the design issues and the feedback, and then we'll take it over to Panos, who will be leading the second part of this lessons to be learned and a discussion about that. So I think our goal is to have quite a open discussion about what this the system is and a sort of a broader perspective of requirements, because as you can see on the right here, you have final project requirements, which might be quite elegant, but it's quite different from what, for example, students turn in. So, of course, everyone knows about the pandemic, and it seems to continue on. And one of the success stories that arose out of the pandemic was the New Zealand lockdown, and in particular, the borders that locked down around New Zealand. So that means that international travel was essentially not allowed. And to get back into New Zealand, particularly for citizens and residents, this idea of managed isolation and quarantine became, it was developed. And what that basically means is that you arrive in New Zealand and you are placed in a hotel, which is repurposed as a quarantine center, and you're meant to stay there for 14 days with tests. I don't know the specifics of the testing strategy, but the idea was that you stay in quarantine until you have a negative test, essentially. And what came from this is a system that is designed to help travelers book manage their rooms in managed isolation and quarantine, or MIQ. And this booking system is the responsibility of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, or MB. And essentially what happens is about 4,000 rooms are released every 2 weeks. And the question is who gets them? So what happens is people use the digital booking system via the internet wherever they are internationally to try to reserve these rooms. And the system gives vouchers to international travelers to stay in MIQ when they arrive in New Zealand. So they are transported to MIQ, they stay there for 14 days. So just give you some context, these sorts of systems are engineered for people. And so this software system has to be used by people. And so there is, in a sense, requirements engineering. So finding out the requirements and analyzing them to make sure that they make sense, and documenting them. So we have ways of extracting this requirement specifications from stakeholders, so developers, the users, and regulators. This MIQ system is particularly complex in the sense that it is in a response to a public health crisis. So it's not in a way a system that is for an end user, like a consumer in a sense, like as a consumer product. So So the way that it works is that people go online and they try to book into the system. And if you've had a look at the MIQ booking system on the MB website, it is quite complex and somewhat unforgiving. So when you arrive, you have to enter your passport number and you're sat in a waiting room. And when the room releases happen, then you essentially join a queue, and the queue is randomized. So there's quite complex rules for travel documents. You need to have your passport's numbers ready, and you have to book MIQ dates that synchronize with your travel dates. And this is particularly complex because you might book an MIQ room for certain dates, but you have no means of actually arriving in New Zealand for those dates. So in a sense, it's quite complex. So there's the non-functional requirements are that you're going to have high volume overloading the site at one time. And there's a lot of technical skills to handle browser, more complex browser usage, such as managing cookies and that sort of thing. And the fact is that if you unexpectedly disconnect from this system, then that might be a deal breaker. You might not be able to get back on, essentially because your passport number is already in use in a queue and you can't use it again. So to get in a perspective of why these things, in the first version of this MIQ booking system, what happens was that vouchers were released immediately as a room became available. So users would typically have to log on to the booking system and refresh all the time. So you could imagine that many people are refreshing, and as soon as something becomes available, they grab it and they go through the process of reserving the rooms and booking their travel. Eventually, a bit of a marketplace popped up, and you could pay someone else to do it for you. So you could then hire someone that is more technically skilled, that would be willing to refresh the page for you and use those credentials to book. And of course, eventually this turned to using bots and automated scripts to check the websites automatically. And of course, that leads to some misuse. So there's a bit of a one-off chance still that if you have the incorrect passport details, you might have to wait for the next room release. So to combat the perceived misuse and unfairness, they designed a lobby system. So now, if you look, that there's scheduled room releases every, I guess every 2 weeks now. And essentially what happens is about 1 hour prior to the rooms being released, people can arrive in the system and wait in a virtual lobby. And when the rooms are released, when the vouchers become available, then all the users get placed in a random queue. So they essentially get a random position in a queue, and the queue, people at the beginning of the queue can access the website to and vouchers and obtain a voucher. So now this is a little bit high stakes, because if you have an error of entering your passport details, you could potentially have to rejoin the queue. And according to user reports, it really is thousands of people waiting in the queue. So the people's response to this, they did an anonymous survey, and you can read the report by Grounded Kiwis, I think is the user group that presented this survey. The user satisfaction was quite low. And the reports described the average user using this as that their emotions are quite high. They really would like to come back to New Zealand. They might be in a place where there's a very complex set of situations that these users are in. So they're quite stressed as well. And this system doesn't exactly empathize. So it reports your exact spot in the queue, and literally there are tens of thousands of people in front of you waiting for maybe a couple thousands of rooms. So the common user response is devastation, they're heartbroken, and potentially relief that they actually do get a room at the end of this. So I'm going to hand over to Panos to discuss how we can learn some lessons on the functional requirements on this side. Thank you, Panos.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ken. So, I guess you had the nice part of describing the applications. I will have the unfortunate part to sound critical. So I want to just clarify this, that we're not people who were in the development team. And our goal is really not to attack this particular implementation. We're just using this,
not at all. Yeah,
as a means to highlight what lessons could be learned exactly, and what could be adopted in the information engineering space. Yeah. So please don't. Yes.
Yeah, I should highlight that these sorts of systems are done in a way that it is in response to a public health crisis. So it's not necessarily any sort of criticism directly directed to the developers or MB or anyone like that. We're just discussing the system and some lessons to be learned. So just as a comment to all of our all of our listeners right now.
Exactly. Thanks. So we started our analysis with the functional requirements, and as you remember, most of you, functional requirements is what our software needs to be doing. We'll be talking for non-functional requirements in a while, which is the constraints around our software. So an important consideration here is that this MIQ booking system has to be able to achieve fairness, because essentially this is what the people who use it would want. And because this is an electronic system, this fairness needs to be effectively communicated to the people. And a big problem with the first version was that it wasn't really meeting this requirement, because if someone was more technically savvy, if they had the capacity to write a script that repeatedly then they had an advantage, and that's not something that should have been the case. Or someone with more money, they could simply outsource this to someone else. They could pay. And again, this is probably something that wasn't considered in the beginning, but it needs to be considered as we're developing something. Hence, the design of the requirements needs to take these things into consideration. Also, another consideration here was, when we're building a system, we should be considering the level of familiarity that people already have. That's an important component in the human-computer interaction space, because when people are used into using a system in a specific way, ideally, we want to remake it in such a way that it's not going to contain any surprises. So what would have been an analogy here is booking sites. So there is a number of booking sites, and people are probably quite adept in using them. So an idea would have been to kind of leverage some of the design concepts from these existing places and try to make it a bit simple, like imitate the design. Also, potentially consider being a little bit more forgiving or simplify the process when travel document policies are enforced, because apparently that was a big problem. People would make a mistake with their passport, right, Ken? And then they would have to just restart, correct?
Yeah, it's sometimes a little bit unclear about how it actually worked. But I know that early on, at least when they came out with the second version, that if you did have the incorrect passport number on a voucher and it didn't match up to your documents, then that would potentially invalidate it. I'm not sure how forgiving it actually was.
But yeah, when we're dealing with this kind of environment where people are so desperate, we have to be able to perhaps consider something that takes into account people's emotions and and reduce their frustration. Also, another important suggestion was how to pair up better people that are traveling in groups or pairs. so that they can, if they already belong in the same bubble, then they can essentially book rooms at the same time, or one room. I don't know how exactly would that work physically, but the idea would have been that there's already the capacity to do group booking in booking websites. So perhaps this is something that could have been thought of and incorporated, right?
Yeah, I think that there is a type of booking functionality on that, where you have a collection of passports that you can make under a booking. Again, the MIQ website is quite detailed on what users have to do, and that in itself means that whilst it's well documented, it's also a lot to take in whenever you're trying to book these particular travel plans.
Peter, I saw you turn your camera on. You have something to add?
I just think, again, these are certainly complex problems, and I really sympathize with the developers.
Yeah.
And we can kind of observe from the outside that as they tried to solve one problem, they created another one. Again, they're trying to solve the multiple people trying to book for the same kind of passport. Okay, well, now we're using a passport as a key indicator for our database. But again, issues on the website, caching and cookies and similar mean that it creates other things. And again, that fairness, like anything, if you've got to explain your user interface, you've probably done it wrong. So just because you've got that kind of detailed manual on how to do this, that should all kind of be built into our IT engineering processes, and specifically kind of software application engineering. And I think, again, it's very clear that they had to prioritize timeliness and schedule for this project, not take some time to develop a robust user interface, backend platform and similar.
Very good point. And who knows how long these systems are in place for. I always got the feeling whenever I was reading it and discussing it with people that the life cycle of these actual systems, I mean, will MIQ after maybe next year be done with? It's hard to say. I don't have that answer. So that is also a question of a little bit of a temporary solution.
So I should add, there is a comment from Simon Tate. I got a voucher with passport number A. The passport then expired prior to travel. A quick and easy email to MIQ was all that was required to change the voucher to passport number B.
Perfect. That's great.
I think this is something that actually highlights the unequal tech capabilities, because it might be quick and easy email for us, like as developers, to do this, but I'm thinking that that could be a barrier for an older person. So we might need mechanisms that, even though we think that they work for developers, they create this kind of unequal situation. So yes, it might be easy to send an email, but maybe not for everyone. So maybe the system needs to be incorporating some sort of further fairness.
Yeah. And I think, kind of to extend that out, it's those edge cases, right? Where we look at Simon's example, that's probably not kind of the main pathway that people use, but might impact between 1% and 0.5% of users. And there'll be at least a dozen, if not hundreds of other edge cases, which the system in its pure instance isn't going to cater for. It's just going to do that simple, reliable thing that we've asked it to from a storyboarding perspective. But having that escalation pathway around edge cases, I think, is always incredibly important, so that we can make sure we pick up people like Simon and others that have changes, have expiries, have lost their passport, and similar.
So maybe a solution. Yes, go ahead, Ken.
Sorry, I was just going to switch the slide. But
before this, I was just thinking maybe a solution to this would have been that the website itself actually provides a way to escalate instead of having to send an email. Like maybe there's a live chat, or you can, after 2 clicks, hit a complaint, and you can have a live chat with someone, but not, you probably need to stay within the platform versus expecting people to use another platform. That would have probably been my thought about this.
As you switch to the next slide, Ken, I'll again play devil's advocate with Panos. I can imagine that all of those, what do we say, 24,000 people aiming for 4,000 rooms, thousands of those will be pulling up the chat box and kind of being a bit disgruntled. So it's a really complex. There are no right answers quite often as developers and engineers. Yeah, we're aiming for the best outcome, but sometimes we just have to choose the least worst one. And I think there's a few lessons in that.
That's right. And the main issue is there's just not enough rooms. If there was enough rooms to people, then, I mean, no problem. I would just go through this and book the room, and it wouldn't be an issue. Okay, so next slide.
So the other part that we wanted to discuss is non-functional requirements, and this has to do with constraints around the actual operation of the system. So, you know, these are a little bit more esoteric, but these are things that we need to be considering every time as well. So there was some reports that if people were to be refreshing, they might be losing their connection, and that would be the case if the system just maintains a specific type of connection. That could have been overcome by developing the back end a little bit differently, so that it keeps track of who you are in a stateless way, so that it doesn't have to essentially connect with the specific session that you're on, but a slightly different implementation to avoid losing your position in the queue in case something bad happens and you're disconnected. You can get back to it. So there are many games, for example, that have this kind of capability. You log into a game, your browser crashes or your computer crashes. You started, you go back to the website, and because you've logged in, it can just put you back directly where you were. So general, in order to ensure that there are no faults, you know, we're recommending that regression testing pipelines need to be established. And this is essentially before you have an automated CI/CD framework that many of you would be aware of. The idea is that you design tests ahead of time, and when you push commit, these tests are run. They verify and validate that what you've done actually makes sense and passes through regression. And it does this in a local testing environment before someone says, yes, let's move on to production. Another concern that we kind of highlighted was that the system became sluggish. And that was probably because of the bursty type of loads that it had. Like the moment that there was a room available, people will start hitting F5 like crazy. So there's going to be like this huge spike on the amount of requests to the system. As such, load testing is required to assure that the system will continue operating as intended, even under heightened levels of pressure. And on the back end, what we normally would be recommending is that auto-scaling is enabled. And auto-scaling is a mechanism that allows you to dynamically add more and more computing resources proportionally to the amount of requests that you have coming into the system. And you can also do this proactively. And in our case, in this case, proactively would mean I know that a room will open at that time. So I will go ahead of time and schedule more computing resources to actually do this. And like another important component that we need to be thinking is usability. And usability, because in many cases, it's us as developers who do the testing, but we're not real users. Like we take for granted a number of things that non-experienced people do not. So we shouldn't be developing and we shouldn't be testing with ourselves. We need a separation between the testing team and the developing team, and the testing team needs to be thinking as end users, not as developers. So kind of, you know, some general comments that you probably apply to virtually every software project out there. I don't know, guys, what do you think?
Thanks, Panos. I guess there was a question whether or not when this version 2 of the system came out and there was going to be a scheduled room release, if the system could handle the increased load. And it did actually. Like I didn't hear of any particular issues with the system. So that was really good news. So I think that that worked out quite well. And I haven't heard of the system crashing like it did with my vaccine pass and people can't access it. So again, all of these systems are brought up online very quickly. We're not talking years of development. We're talking maybe weeks. I don't know. So to the credit of people that are developing it, it are complex systems that are a lot of question marks on how they're going to be used.
Indeed. And so, that's a check mark on their side. And I'm assuming something like this was implemented on the back end, because it's a common practice nowadays to include auto scaling. So in my team here, we're sometimes talking about the Reddit effect. And this is the situation where your app works perfectly, and then someone mentions it on Reddit, everybody goes in, the app crashes because you haven't thought of this kind of increased spike, and then your app is dead. So, this is something that we need to be considering, that when we're prototyping an application, there are different expectations than when it's going to be running live, and the transition can happen exponentially fast. So this is something to keep in mind. So the design for your full load ahead of time, not just with your prototyping load.
Yeah, I'm sure both professionals and students on the call will have that kind of, you've developed something as a minimum viable product, it works, it does the minimum requirements of what you need to do. But here we were looking at that resilience of how well does it stand up, how well does it continue delivering as we scale, as you find edge cases, as again, maybe some redevelopment of code, additional features, add something new but breaks something old. And again, putting it to the test against real users is where it comes to fruition, as well as we try and scale, because the platform requirements, right? Software, IT, whatever we want to look at, the requirements for 1 versus 10 versus 100 versus 1,000 versus 10,000 and 1,000,000 is very different. And some of the things scale well and some of the things obviously don't. So I think, again, kind of making sure in that lessons learned, we're thinking about that future state of mind and making sure that minimum viable product, we're designing in some of those scaling things if we're going to be releasing it into the general public for thousands of people to use all at the same time.
Indeed. And one crucial non-functional requirement is that of security. We haven't included it explicitly in here, but it could be thought of that these bots that we're doing a refresh all the time are kind of almost a denial of service attack. This is something that we need to be considering. What kind of defense mechanisms do we have in place? If we see someone from the same IP or the same clusters of IPs repeatedly firing up requests, maybe we need to be considering sending them to a Shark Tank where a reCAPTCHA kind of a screen shows up. And you don't need to implement these things on your own as developer. There are already ready-made solutions that you can connect to your application.
Yeah, I suppose on the security thing, sorry, I'll pass you in a minute, Ken, that one of those things that hasn't come up, and so probably credit to the developers and the SEC team that are associated with this project, because we know that this thing was being hammered left, right, and center, and we would have known if it was incredibly vulnerable. Again, there's some really good mindsets around Sec DevOps and similar to integrate security into the design process. Pretty much everyone from a professional or academic process knows that you don't try and bolt on security at the end. You've got to start with it at the beginning and have that secure development lifecycle. So certainly probably some credit goes out there, and it's really easy to poke holes at the things that went wrong, but we do want to make sure that we do pay attention to the things that potentially went right, either by design or by accident, and sometimes by accident is because of the design. Ken?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add that as Panos was saying, with the bots that could be considered as a type of attack, one of the good things, I suppose, about the lobby system is that you tend to have then an expected burst of user activity rather than unexpectedly throughout the day. If there's many bots hammering on the system, you just move that all to a particular time for room release and you're ready for it. So that removes at least one unknown.
Yeah, I suppose like here where like if we look again, put our security hat on, looking at some conventional DDoS protection mechanisms. If we look at NZX, obviously there was some strategies that could be used that most of NZX users that wanted to continue to use the platform in spite of an ongoing DDoS campaign were probably New Zealand based. And this example, obviously, most of the people that are trying to get rooms are going to be overseas based, so we can't just kind of apply a geo type filter on that. But yeah, there are some kind of standard mechanisms that can be used. Again, if they're thought about ahead of time and or in the moment, as we see, for example, that My COVID Pass, essentially, as soon as it was released, DDoSed by 4 to 5 million people trying to get their COVID Pass out before the traffic light kicks in. So,
yeah,
I've read about techniques that they're essentially detecting the likelihood that a certain IP or sets of IPs are potential to be malicious, and they slowly starting to place them, all of the malicious IPs together on the same servers. So at least, they kind of impede each other instead of impeding the actual legit users.
Yeah, it's like anything in security, you can go down some rabbit holes and spend a whole lifetime on any one particular element of security. Certainly, as the adversaries have got smarter, so have the defenders, and the mechanisms and the tools and the constructs and the techniques that we can use to evade them and kind of stay one step ahead of the cat and mouse game with those that seek to either do harm or cause outage or again gain funds for their activities. So yeah, it's a continuous journey in security just to manage that risk going forward. And again, probably some fair credit to the team here, and that we didn't see, not that it didn't happen, but we didn't see on the front page that the system had been compromised by adversaries and that way.
Indeed. Let's move on to the next slide, Ken. And in the meantime, please, for everyone who's watching, type your questions. We're expecting it to be kind of a live discussion, so we'll be trying to incorporate your thoughts and use them as a starting point for a discussion. So, what are the kind of IT engineering practices that we should be considering to essentially keep, stop, and start, which is kind of the main outcome that we're hoping out of this webinar. So we thought that it's really important to keep the development ingenuity after the requirements are set. So we believe that this idea of randomizing the lobby, this was probably a smart developer coming up with it. I'm not sure, but I think so. This kind of intrinsic problem solving that software engineers have is something that we should definitely keep, and it's probably what gives the biggest joy, I think, in our profession: the capacity to solve cool problems in innovative ways. So this is definitely a keeper, I would say, for us. The stopper would probably be we should not be thinking of implementing for the typical user because what we think is typical is probably ourselves, and we're not typical users. So I'm saying here, most people are not familiar with what F5 and F12 do for your browser. And I'm sure the various full stack and web developers that are following us here, they know what I'm talking about, but you should not be expecting that a user should use F12 and go and hack into your HTML and JavaScript to be able to perform a task or recover from a mistake, or even an F5, like not even a simple refresh. Also, on the other end, we need to be thinking that users might be trying to break the system, and they could be trying to break the system either with conventional or unconventional ways. It could be that they're going to try and hit various things in ways that you were not expecting them to do it because they're doing things in the wrong order, or they have a malicious intent and they're trying to do things in other ways. And if you're not doing this already, we would strongly recommend that you start immediately quality assurance methods. And when I say quality assurance, I mean primarily automated. So what you need to be doing is ensure that before something goes into production, it is thoroughly tested from a variety of angles. So a good way would be to have a regression CI/CD pipeline. And that essentially, as I said earlier, enables you to, from the moment you do a commit to a new version, all the way by the time that you put it to production, to take it through a thorough set of steps. So you could be, and you can do this automatically with modern tools that are available in the cloud. So you can start by ensuring that your obviously your code packages and compiles properly, and that's the easiest thing to do. And then it does some sort of verification that just goes through the code and ensure that the code makes sense from like a simple looking at the code perspective. Then your next step is ensuring that unit tests pass, then integration tests pass, and you put it into an intermediate staging space where you can run more thorough end-to-end and regression tests, and you can even include manual testing before you have someone saying, yes, we're ready now, let's move it from staging to our final production. And in all of this, we should not be forgetting usability testing. It's important to, just because something passes our test doesn't mean that it's good, because the tests might not have thought of weird corner cases that a human will actually run into. So definitely try to include these as well in your methodologies. So guys, I don't know if you want to add something on these keep, stop, and start ideas for what we recommend.
We have some chat comments.
I was just dropping around that again, developing for those edge cases with the guy with a gun testing a bulletproof vest to see if we could get some talk capping in chat. Again, of course, all of this can happen through experience. Again, those of us that have been around, and that's what kind of provides a definition between your junior developer and your senior developer. They've got the scars, they've implemented some of these things. And of course, the more you build into that automated testing platform, that's going to set you up for more chances of success. There'll always be, again, staying one step ahead of our user. But coming back to that engineering and solving a problem using the ways and means, whether that's through IT software or all of the disciplines that Engineering New Zealand support, there's just working through that problem statement and developing that solution. I think there's some great fundamental things that we can come and apply in IT engineering and software application engineering that are fundamental engineering techniques in terms of development side. Your thoughts, Ken?
No, I agree. Just going back to my earlier comments of the usability of the system has to match the typical user. And most of them are not developers and have only the basics of web browsing and computer literacy. And you know, why should they have to have a degree in software engineering to use a system to book tickets to MIQ? You know, so yeah.
And to kind of close the loop with you know, usability testing. So what are we testing? We need to be testing against requirements, which means that we first need to discover the requirements, which means that we need to ensure that we do proper requirement solicitation to figure out what these requirements are, and not assume that we're just designing based on our own experience.
How do we do that in these sorts of public health you know, systems that are developed in response to public health crisis? Like what could the developers do?
So I think a quick and dirty way would be to do paper prototypes. So this is the idea that instead of trying to develop a full system that takes a lot of effort and then throw it away, or keep it because now you're quite, yeah, exactly. What you can do is bring in people, ensure that you select them to be representative. You probably want to give them some incentives, give them some Kai. Bring them in. And then what you need to do is you sit next to them You take a piece of paper and you draw how you think your software will look. And you tell them, okay, now you need to achieve this. What will you do? And you let them essentially play forward. And they say, oh, I'm going to click here. Now you take the paper and you draw how you think the system should react. You do this back and forth with everyone. And this is going to be a very low cost way to elicit requirements for people that do not have the technical expertise to abstract away other things. So they can see something working, quote unquote, in front of them. So that would be a way forward. And software engineering has a number of these kind of requirements elicitation techniques, but paper prototyping is probably the easiest to achieve.
Yeah, if we from my experience, and again, I'm not a software developer. We do in my background, control systems engineering. We're usually developing HMIs for control room environments across industrial plants. But quite often, when you're sitting with people and trying to elicit what do they need, what are the workflows, what's the storyboarding, it can be a struggle to have that communication and dialogue. Whereas if you put something in front of someone, they will tell you what they don't like far quicker than they'll tell you what they do like. And so kind of, as you say, the iterative process, agile, again, plenty of techniques out there. But again, having that iterative design process, so you're not relying on a sunk cost of we've spent so much time on this development that we can't go back out now. And yeah, just working with people, a variety of people. As you say, if you make sure you cater your meetings, you'll have people show up.
I think that there's an issue is that I think that 100% of the users are overseas, because I think that would be a true. And it's interesting. It's not simply just how the system reacts, but it's also what the user. And for example, showing the exact location in the queue was very hard for some people because it had a sense of hopelessness because there are so many thousands of people in front of them compared to that might for maybe a developer be very precise and say, well, now you know you're fifth in the queue or you're 18,000 in the queue. So I wonder if having less information given to the user is actually better. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. Thinking about those kind of mindsets again, like if I'm aware of was it Heathrow Airport, where instead of changing the pathway, instead of improving their times of the baggage from the plane to the carousel, they just made the pathways longer so that people had a 10-minute walk to the carousel instead of a 2-minute walk to the carousel. By the time they weave their way through the airport, their bags were arriving, and so solving problems in different ways is certainly going to be something to keep in mind as you're looking to address things. And that less is more. I'm a big fan of less is more. Keep it simple. Again, the fundamental engineering practices that we can apply and just as well in software development.
And kind of plugging into the recent article that we published around embracing Maturang and Kopapa in software engineering. I think this is something to also consider when we're listing requirements. We need to include a broad spectrum of people, and remember that in New Zealand, there is a big group of people who are Maori, and because they are Maori, we need to be following the specific ways and communicate in the same language. So this is something that we need to always keep in mind. That will allow us to just elicit better requirements that are the right product made for the people.
Yeah, I think some of those ways, as we think about different ways to engage with different genders, different ethnicities, different age brackets. Again, some of the challenges that our older demographic have with technology, we end up catering for that more typical user. So as we've got on the screen there, our typical user will be able to use a platform that we've thought about. Some of our atypical or minority users and we do need to make sure that we have some good coverage across that to support our entire user base to the extent possible, and make sure that where we don't have that coverage, we've got some of those escalation pathways.
And I think particularly for this kind of systems that are generated by the government, they must adhere to the very least the requirement of being useful for Maori people. Like that would be the minimum kind of coverage in terms of internationalization and globalization and atypical users, or whatever you want to. We shouldn't even be using this term.
Yeah. Well, as getting back to the start of the seminar, is that the software is for the people really to use. It solves a real world problem that people have, and people are integral in the software itself, using it. Okay, next slide. Oh, conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's it. I want to remind our audience to please ask any questions that you might have.
Yeah.
And we can wait for a couple of minutes in case there's any questions. Or guys, Peter, is there anything else that you would like to add on this?
I think this is a really good discussion on the technical side of things, also from the public health perspective in the context of emergency systems having to solve a problem that didn't exist, mere months ago. So I think there's a lot of credit due to the developers of these systems that really probably are working under timelines and maybe some missing requirements. I did notice on the MB website that there's been over 200 improvements to the system since it's been released. So credit is to them for keeping it up and having a quick response time to any issues that I'm sure that the users might have identified that they didn't realize at first, but are very quick to respond.
Yeah, I think it's been an incredibly challenging pandemic for our government kind of developer space, and this obviously all the health related. I had an opportunity to support my local civil defence, and a lot of the systems that we were developing on the fly from an operations and welfare perspective, and dealing with kind of that safety net of society were things that had been talked about previously, but never got around to it, that whole round to it problem. But there was already some thought processes in place where we could say, okay, well, this is how we're dealing with supplying the community with food and shelter for 4 weeks and things like that. It was a bit of an eye opener for me in that, but yes, over the last kind of 2 years of the global pandemic, a lot of new systems, and that systems integration, again, where we see the testing and the vaccine processes semi-independent. And some technical constraints on that as well. I can see a lot of people asking why we need 2 different apps, and that's actually come straight from Google and Apple. But if you're not technical, you might not understand that nuance of how those things kind of play out. So I think we haven't seen the back of it, but hopefully create some lessons learned in the future for both health sector and everyone else kind of developing across the space.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I think to kind of summarize some of the important things that we kind of said was that we need to ensure that we do proper requirements elicitation so that we ensure that we solve the right problem. Developers are smart people and they like to solve problems, but we need to remember that finding out what is the right problem is a problem in itself versus solving the problem that we like to solve. And another component is at the end, we also need to go back and connect continuously with what we made, if this is indeed what we're supposed to be making. Did we make the right thing? Did we make it right in an automated and continuous way? Think beyond ourselves. There are other people out there that don't have the technical skills that we have, so empathize with them. Okay. We don't have anything else to add, I think, and I'm not seeing anything, any other questions. So maybe at this stage, Ken, Peter, thank you very much, I guess. Anything else you'd like to add?
Thank you very much to our participants as well in the chat.
Yes, yeah, thanks to Engineering New Zealand, Holly and the team for supporting this. And again, if you'd like to kind of engage in this way more, feel free to reach out to the IT Engineering Technical Interest Group. I might drop the link into chat. There's a bunch of us that kind of get together and talk about these sorts of things around how we can improve and progress the IT engineering discipline and formalize that more. So feel free to reach out.
Great.
Exactly. I would like to reiterate this call. Please come join us. We need you because it shouldn't be just us. IT Engineers has been recently created to represent all the professionals in the field. Looking forward to having more on you join us, and any ideas that you have, anything in any ways that we can be helpful, we're very keen to hear about it.